So thank you everyone for watching or listening to Howling Coyote. And I'm really thrilled that Linda Tuhiwa Smith is joining me today. And I hope I pronounced your middle name correctly. My Maori is not so great. And anyway, she's the author of a wonderful book on Indigenous methodology that a number of us have read and avidly. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with her. And Linda, do you want to say anything more about your origins, your country, your location, etc.?
Kia ora, greetings everyone. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and at the moment I'm coming to you from a place called Rotorua in the middle of the North Island. So thank you for having me, and hopefully we have a good conversation, Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. So I thought I would jump in with by telling you about a conversation I had with a colleague from the University of Toronto who was asked to prepare a paper on evidence-based traditional healing. And he discovered that he couldn't come up with evidence that the mainstream people who were demanding this from him would accept. And I wondered if you encountered that and if you have thoughts about how we relate to mainstream reductionist, logical, positivist researchers who discount anything but the randomized control trial.
Yeah, but even if you had a randomized control trial, they wouldn't necessarily accept it anyway, because the thing with evidence-based policy and evidence-based or claims to use evidence as the basis for good governance and good decision making is those in power decide what is good evidence. Those in power determine what counts as evidence, and they set criterion, they set benchmarks and standards that, you know, only a narrow kind of set of research really even qualifies to be included. But when you look at the decisions they make, 90% of it, they use no evidence. They talk to someone down the road and, you know, they count that as evidence. And politicians in particular are terrible, because evidence is whatever their neighbour said to them, or, you know, if they were speaking to someone in power who didn't like a particular point of view, that becomes what informs their ideas about knowledge. And so I'm really skeptical about any claims to evidence-based decision making. My question is always, well, what evidence counts? Who determines what counts? And even if you have the evidence, would you really listen?
Indeed, we've certainly seen that in the United States, and in particular, I think in medicine we suffer deeply from the tyranny of the randomized control trial. And I've come across a couple groups who are criticizing RCTs as the only way to gain knowledge. There's a group at Tufts University in Boston and another group at the University of Washington in Seattle, and you may know of others. But um, I mean, it seems important to critique it, and yet no one cares, has been my experience.
Yeah.
That, yeah, that it's the RCT or nothing.
Well, and it's convenient, isn't it, for decision makers to fall back on that when half of them don't even know what they're talking about. And, for the wider social science arena, randomized controlled studies are considered really unethical. It's okay in medicine when you're testing drugs and, you need strict control groups to really be able to monitor. But for so much of social policy, you can't do that to people. You can't put them into, a randomized or control group and then not do anything about that. It's a very artificial, false way of trying to get, yes, this reductionist idea of, what works and what doesn't work. The best example of, what we're talking about here is the rollout of the vaccines for COVID all around the world. You can have the randomized controlled studies for testing the vaccine. It makes no difference whatsoever for all the work that has to go on in public health to make that idea palatable to people, to provide a service delivery mode for people to be able to influence communities. Randomized control studies don't help decision makers do that.
And they don't, and
In fact, they stuff it up.
right, they certainly don't convince skeptical people to get vaccinated. That's for sure. Yeah. I remember there was a period of time before I gave up on getting funding for this particular project, in which I was trying to get government funding to look at traditional healers. And my idea was to take a group of relatively homogeneous people with a condition. I think I had picked asthma because it's easy to measure airway resistance. And my thought was, well, let's just have some of them do business as usual, and let's have some of them go see the traditional healer. And it was going to be done on one of the reservations. And I thought, well, we can randomly assign them, to where they're going to go. And of course, some of them will, break the randomization and go where they want anyway, but still, it's randomization. And to my surprise, the only way that I could get funding was if the traditional healers did everything exactly the same to every single person. And I'm like, well, that's not going to happen. I mean, that's not what they do. And how is that fair? To tie their hands behind their back and then compare what they can do with their hands tied behind their back to business as usual. And, I never convinced the study group that my idea had any validity. And it was as if, it was two cultures completely not communicating.
Yeah, and yeah, we do have to be very careful about agreeing for our knowledge to be put under those constraints or put in those boxes, because that reduces their efficacy and their power and their specialness, because they're not commensurate. They're not a medicine in the traditional Western medicine kind of or treatment. model. They are come from a particular worldview, and they are meaningful in a particular sort of philosophy, and they make sense for, you know, Native peoples and Indigenous peoples who still live by those philosophies. So, I mean, we've had that here in New Zealand as well, where, you know, all sorts of different tests were devised to see whether it works or doesn't work. I think they've given up on that now, because for us, we still use our traditional healers when we need to, because they deliver or give us other things that Western medicine doesn't give us. They give a read on our spirituality, for example. They are interested in our wider sense of well-being. And they have a greater responsibility to us in terms of their relationship with us, or our relationship with them as well. So it is a struggle often in the Indigenous knowledge space to even try to conform and fit into these sort of medical modes of knowledge, and Western medical modes in particular. And you know, in a way, those modes do harm. They do harm to us and our belief systems, and they do harm to our knowledge. So I think we've got to be very cautious about where we engage in those systems and where we try and do research in those spaces, and where we choose maybe not to. There's enormous value in looking and trying to do both. I mean, that's what our researchers and practitioners are trying to do, is, you know, they use science when they need to, and they use Indigenous knowledge when they need to. And they often try and do those in single research projects. And, you know, we talk about it as this interface of Indigenous knowledge and science. And there's a lot of research that's happening in that space for us.
Yes, and in Canada, and well, and where I live, there's an elder, Albert Marshall, who has been advocating this concept. Two-eyed seeing is the way he describes it, and in his language, it's Edoaptamunk, and it's a challenge because the mainstream science is always privileged when the two get together.
It dominates, and it's not just the science or the knowledge, it's the people, the scientists, who dominate, and who use their notion of skepticism to talk too much. Like, they don't know when to shut up, and they don't know how to listen. I mean, I've done research projects where I've brought scientists together with Indigenous knowledge keepers, and you know, we use these different processes to try and help scientists and Indigenous knowledge keepers have an equitable dialogue, be able to talk together respectfully about the things that they do. And when we started our study, we actually had to pull the scientists aside. They can't even talk to each other respectfully across different sciences. And I found it really intriguing how scientists behave, because they're not, I mean, they obviously don't all behave the same way. There is diversity, but they've got interesting ways in which they put down other knowledge systems. They marginalize other knowledge systems. They marginalize difference and divergence, and yet claim, this privilege of being skeptical about other knowledge systems. But when those people are skeptical about their system, they get all irate and pack a big sad sack response. So it's the system, it's the knowledge, and it's the people who are trained in that system who can be really difficult.
How did you make it work? How were you able to?
Well, we ended up working 2 different groups. We then handpicked some of our scientists, because there were scientists who we know just have fabulous relationships with Māori. So we used them to help us facilitate the scientists. And that's when I sort of observed that, scientists are trapped in their own subjectivities and their own sense of what it means to be a scientist. And it's a very privileged position that they give themselves, in the way they describe themselves. But what we witnessed in our study is it doesn't hold up even when they talk to other scientists who are in different disciplines. So if you put your biologists and your chemists, your engineers, your biomedical researchers or research scientists, they struggle for a common language. So they can talk about science in an abstract sense, but they often don't respect each other's science. And they're also, as you know, reductionists. They deal with small units of analysis. They don't really care about the complexity at the wider level. Maybe theoretical physics people do, but many of them are dealing with very small units of analysis. And with our Indigenous knowledge keepers, they come at problems from the holistic perspective. And, they're talking about the whole and the big picture, and then the different components within that. And many of our scientists are talking with the tiny little unit and no regards for the whole. So different worldviews, interesting engagements. Is there hope? Yes, because there are some good people on both sides who like to think about these issues and like to engage and are prepared to have their own views challenged. And then, there are others who you can't move them. They're stuck in their groove.
Right. So the project that you're talking about, what was the question and what were the results?
The question was whether we could establish, respectful dialogue between Indigenous knowledge and science. And I completed the project. We completed about 7 years ago, 10 years ago. I can send you a publication.
Sure, I'd love that. Yeah.
Reference that we did on that. And it has since evolved into multiple other projects of, exploring this interface of different knowledge systems. It's actually in New Zealand, there's a lot of research now in the Indigenous knowledge space. It is funded, it's recognised in our science system. It is expected that researchers who apply for government-funded research money have to address the question around, are they engaging with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous researchers? So it's a very, purposeful strategy that we've had in New Zealand for the last maybe 20 years. So out of that, we've, basically there's a new generation of researchers who are quite comfortable working whether they're Indigenous scientists who work in both areas or whether they're non-Indigenous scientists who work with Indigenous partners.
It seems like New Zealand is a bit ahead of us in North America in that regard. I think the area that I've seen, conventional science and Indigenous knowledge working best has been in environmental science. There's been I've seen some really interesting combination studies on fisheries management. There's a interesting woman from the University of British Columbia who is Indigenous and has a PhD in environmental science and works in this area and has been writing some wonderful papers about, combining the knowledge systems to optimally manage, commercial fishing.
Yeah. Environmental science is very strong in this area of working with Indigenous knowledge. They've been doing that for decades and getting better at doing it. And also there are more native people who are environmental scientists who can bridge both worlds. And that's certainly the case with us. And there's the fisheries, there's the marine science, there's forestry science, there's ecology, and waterways, all the things that really are very, very important to Indigenous communities, our
Right.
environment, our lands, our waterways, our animals.
Right. And it seems like the area that lags the most in this sort of integration is health or medicine. And it strikes me as strangely odd that a holistic perspective would be so readily and quickly discounted that it, for me, and my ancestors are both Indigenous North Americans and also Europeans, so I'm a mix. But for me, it seems so obvious that everything about the way you live and where you live and how you live affects your health, and that creating health is about finding harmony and balance, which would be the traditional Indigenous perspective, and not going right away to medication, to the biochemical approach.
Right. Well, I think clinical trials for pharmaceuticals are a specific sub-branch of medicine, and there's a wider range of sort of biomedical and public health research in which there is a lot of scope to work more with Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge. I know in molecular biology, for example, there have been studies around different cancers and families that run in families where, once again here, scientists have worked with specific Māori communities and have been able to establish the familial relationships, for example, around certain kinds of stomach cancers that have then led to being able to identify or develop a test that has helped communities or people can choose whether they want to find out whether they have that gene. and make decisions about future treatments. So, there's a whole lot of other research in medicine and health, a lot of public health research where I think there's a great deal of opportunities to work with Indigenous communities. I think clinical studies, around testing efficacies of various pharmaceutical interventions, that's just one element of research, and I don't think we need to be too hung up on it.
Yeah, I can see that. It's harder when one practices medicine because the onus is on giving out drugs and not working holistically.
That's right. It's there's health and well-being, and then there's giving out drugs.
That's true.
And I think giving out drugs, and you'll know this with antibiotics, has created other kinds of problems. That there has to be a limit in terms of what drugs can do at the moment, and particularly combinations of drugs that people with multiple morbidities might have, that it doesn't necessarily heal people or cure people. It manages certain sorts of conditions, but it doesn't give them well-being, and it often doesn't improve their quality of life. It might extend their life, but it's not a good life. And I think, I don't know about in the US, because you've got such a different health system, but here in New Zealand there is this tension between what the country can afford in terms of drugs and all the other treatment options that are not based on drugs. It's a big concern how much money a country has to spend on drug treatments versus maybe prevention strategies and better primary healthcare systems. All those sorts of political issues,
Right, right,
are a big concern.
right. And you're so right that the US healthcare system is, it's designed to generate a profit for the owners, whoever they are. And it does that very well. But it isn't designed to produce health in the recipients of the care, or I might not even say care, the recipients of the transactions that take place. Yeah. And so that leads me to a question that we've been wrestling with, which is, so we're starting a center, we're calling it the Healing Lodge, and it's a place for people to come that have problems with substance use and issues around mental health. And we have a goal to integrate cultural practices as much as possible, while still having some more mainstream therapies, such as seeking safety and DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And so the challenge that we have is that the people who fund such things want proof that integrating culture makes a difference. And of course, the kind of proof that they would like is, as you might imagine, some sort of randomized controlled trial, which is clearly not possible. So how would you advise us? How do we do something that's indigenously meaningful and still please the people who give out the money?
So there are other healing centres around the world. There's a big one in Hawaii, in Oahu, which has been going quite a long time, where they do have traditional healers, but they also have GP practice, maternity health practice, and I think they've got like a emergency health centre. So I think there are these centres where different treatments coexist, if you like, and they're more like community-based practices. I think sometimes funders set, they're simply unrealistic, dumb goals. I don't know how you tell them they're dumb, that the goals are dumb in the sense that you need the time and space to develop the measures of what works and what doesn't work. And the use of a one-size-fits-all case study control or randomized control study that is completely inappropriate for what it is it's trying to capture, I think needs pushback. And I know that's hard because they hold on to the money. But in a sense, if you want status quo outcomes, well, you're going to fund status quo initiatives. If you want transformative outcomes, they've got to fund the transformative potential. They've got to take that risk. And they've got to think about these other strategies. I mean, there are basic ethics involved, the principle of do no harm, I think, applies to whatever the treatments are. There are, principles that protect people, that demonstrate integrity, that they're more important in this space for enabling some of these treatments to be trialed or used or tested with communities.
Right. And my approach, I do life story research, and my approach has been to collect stories of transformation and to look at the common elements that people report around their transformation as they work with traditional healers. And as you can imagine, for the most part, it's extremely difficult to get this kind of work into medical journals. Just doesn't happen. And yet, to me, it seems quite powerful, the voices of the people themselves and how they see what's shifted in their lives and their explanations for what brought it about. And yet it's to the mainstream to the mainstream of the profession from which I come, it's completely meaningless drivel. Just doesn't.
And that's what we're up against. That's a reality, if you like, of power and colonialism, settler colonialism. The amazing thing is, Indigenous communities persist, and there is something powerful in healing approaches that I think appeal to our people. And if you're building a healing centre, that's fantastic. I know several initiatives here that are trying to build or establish healing centres as well for dealing with addictions, but also trauma, intergenerational trauma, and all kinds of, different sort of ways in which we think that the strategy that works for us has to be based on a healing paradigm, not a medical model paradigm. Because the medical model paradigm is not about healing, might be about fixing people up, but healing to us is holistic. It's about reconnecting people back to their knowledge, their identity, their history, their relationships often. It's about a restoration of culture. It's about ensuring that all parts of their being, their sense of identity, their cultural self, their spiritual self, their linguistic self, their physical self, their psychological self, are all in harmony, are all able to sit in balance, if you like. And I think that notion of healing is really meaningful for Indigenous peoples and others who've suffered this sort of intergenerational and historic trauma. Because a pill does not fix up the harm of colonialism.
Right. Right. And locating the problem in an individual doesn't achieve social justice. So, yeah. And one of the messages that I got from your book, and I hope I read it correctly, was I think you were saying that Indigenous people just need to develop their own methodologies and, in a sense, ignore the mainstream. To just say, well, we're going to do it our way. And if you don't like it, well, too bad. Did I read that correctly?
You did. And that's been our approach here in Aotearoa. Because those other treatments, they're there anyway. You can go and choose them if that's what you want. But we have our existing methodologies, but we're also capable of designing new ones that fit with our new contexts. And so I think it is about improving our sense of agency over our own lives. It's about using and drawing from our own models of well-being to, help create this more healing environment. And it's about really aspiring to these more transformative outcomes, because I think what we understand from our health system, our education system, our criminal justice system, our economic system, is that those systems are designed quite purposefully to disadvantage our people, to exclude them, to marginalize them, and to keep them in this perpetual state of impoverishment and powerlessness. And, the only way we're going to change that, the question theoretically is, can the oppressor change themselves? Can the colonizer transform themselves? Well, all the theory in those areas say they're incapable of it. They can't. They can't imagine a world in which they're not on top and the boss. or the dominant force. So, that does then beg the question as to what then do colonized groups, marginalized groups, oppressed groups have to do. And, the general theoretical response from, a range of writers is, we have to free ourselves. And we have to do that work to liberate ourselves, to exercise agency, and to have some belief, like especially for Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, to recover our belief in ourselves, our belief in our people, our belief in, the good things about our philosophies, because they weren't all bad and terrible. We lived, and, Native Americans lived on that continent for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You're in Australia, where the research says there have been Aboriginal people there for 60,000 years, who lived well, who flourished. And in the space of 250 years, have been pretty much almost disappeared with in a settler colonial society. So no one else can do that work. That's the thing. It's like we have to do that work ourselves because no one else can. We don't necessarily have the funding and all the resources and the power even to really do a good job, but we've got no choice but to try, because if we don't try, then we've given up. And if we give up, we don't give the generations to follow us a fighting chance. We lock them out of knowledge and hope, and we make their ancestral knowledge even more distant and more difficult to reclaim.
Right. And that's one of the exciting things about where I work, which is Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, is that our leader, Lisa Sakabason, has been raising money independently of the government, so that she's creating these programs that exist whether the government funds them or not. And I think that's really exciting, because at the conference that I'm attending here in Melbourne, in the Indigenous parts of the program, one of the recurrent themes was, well, when is the government going to help us? I thought, well, maybe they're not going to help you. Come meet our fearless leader who's doing it without the help of government.
That's right. That sounds fantastic. And, in the end, government will come to you, because they can't answer these questions either. So I think, I would encourage you just to believe in yourselves and do what you can. In the end, the evidence is in the work that you do, and that attracts support.
So, on a slightly different topic, could you tell us about a new methodology that you've been involved in developing in the course of your work?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There's always new methodologies or new ways of doing things and thinking about things. What I would say first and foremost, as a researcher trained mostly in the education, social science space, is how we frame our research questions is really, really important, because that then frames our methodologies, our theories, and our methods. And if we get the framing off or get the framing wrong, then everything else that follows, is also going to be off center or not work. So with my own students, I spend a lot of time on having them sort of think really deeply about their research question, examining it for, is it, simple things. Is it deficit oriented? Is it victim blaming? Is it sort of, helicopter research, fly in, exploit, fly out? Sort of thinking about all these types of research that we know from research, that has been done to Indigenous peoples. And it's really important we don't reproduce that unknowingly, unconsciously. So there are ways to examine our questions and to think about, what we're asking and what our assumptions are, which is what I think good social science research needs to do. And then, when we come to the methodologies, and we're not unique in this. I want to say, I'm not unique in this. Feminist scholars, Black American, African American scholars have all been sort of working for these methodologies that in the end work. I mean, that's the test of them. If you need people to speak to you, then what are the contexts in which they will speak to you? And how does that context shape their voice? And, everyone these days seem to want to gather voice, whether it's young people's voices, elders' voices, marginalized voices, Indigenous voices. And, once again, it's like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by voices? How are you going to interpret those voices? Like, who are you to interpret those voices? What makes you competent to even hear those voices, let alone analyze them and interpret them? So there are a lot of questions that I would, use to assess or identify or critique research before we do it. And then the methodologies often fall out of the way we've framed our question. So our culture and our language is a constant source of inspiration around methodologies. You would have heard about, I think feminists talk about kitchen table methodologies because that's often where women are most likely to speak and be open. Well, we have places where, one of them is we call a hui, a particular kind of gathering where we know our people will speak openly. There's still power relations in that space, but our own cultural protocols mediate those relations of power to ensure, that everyone gets to have a voice in that particular environment. We have other cultural protocols for deeper conversations that, require more thoughtfulness, that maybe require people over quite a long course of time being able to express their ideas. Yeah. So, I think our cultures are rich with methodologies that we can use in research.
Can you give us an example of a recent project that maybe you've supervised with a graduate student?
Well, I've got one graduate student who's about to finish her PhD, and she's worked with documentary film and video and has basically pursued a genealogical story over generations and been able to track that by interviewing a wide range of creatives, artists, musicians, composers. And so she's interviewed them all, filmed them all, written children's stories or written stories to reflect back two children who she's then worked with for them to interpret those stories. And she's filmed all that. And, she can sort of show this narrative about their identity as it's crossed from one generation to the next generation to the next generation as a consistent story with these themes, these enduring motifs, enduring themes. And her methodology is, partly built into her creativity, her creative practice, but it's also very much based on the fact she's a fluent Māori language speaker. She's been able to work and interview elders in the Māori language, and she's been able to get them to agree to be filmed and recorded. And then she's been able to observe them in traditional gatherings. So at one level, you might say it's, very ethnographic in one sense. She is from that iwi, but she has provided a structure to it. And as I said, she's on the finishing straight of her PhD. And I think the way we're framing her, methodology is in that sort of creative, reflexive space, and this idea of intergenerational storytelling. So storytelling is a common Indigenous methodology, and what she's been able to show is the different strategies that are used to tell our ancient stories generation to generation to generation, so that, the next generation know the story. All of that is oral, passed on orally.
Sounds fascinating. Is she making a film?
She's made a documentary that will sit in as part of her PhD thesis.
Fabulous.
And she's done it during COVID, during the pandemic. That's created all sorts of barriers for her, but I'm very proud of her. She'll be finished before the end of the year. She's just writing it all up at the moment, doing that sort of heavy intellectual work you have to do.
Right. The final chapter.
Those final chapters, yeah. And
Yes.
the thing with methodology, she's written a lot on it, and I said, well, now, because you've done everything, you're not talking about the methodology you intend to do, you're talking about the methodology you have done. That's it, gives you more confidence because she's done it. She can talk about what she did. And that's a very different position to be writing methodology.
In your work, do you do much with autoethnography?
I read autoethnography, and I've thought about autoethnography, and I've supervised students who wanted to work in that space. I can't say they've all been successful in it. And I'm not sure if I would call any of my recent or current work autoethnographic, but I might want to do something in that space, but it will always have that Indigenous flavour to it anyway, in terms of, my question when I started out, even before I wrote the book, is, what does it mean for you to be an Indigenous researcher writing or researching inside an Indigenous community? What does that mean? Because so much of those early ethnographies, the theories that have shaped ethnography, were written by outsiders working and living amongst Indigenous communities. And now we have Indigenous people working inside their own communities. And what are the questions and the issues that, we have? Are we outsiders, or are we inside outsiders? Are we partially insiders? What are the ethics that govern our behaviors? What if one of our, aunties tells us something we don't want to include in our research? Do we pretend she didn't say it? Do we edit? Those are really powerful ethical questions that I think we grapple with, and we have to grapple with.
And I can certainly relate to the experience of having gone away and become educated, and that sense of coming back in a never quite fit in the same way again experience.
Yeah.
And
we're all changed.
Mhm.
We're all changed by our different experiences, and going home is always an interesting experience as well. But there's no perfect ethnographer. There's no perfect researcher. There's humans who do this work, and I think it's, how do we think about that in ethical ways and in ways that position ourselves honestly, so those who read our work kind of get a good sense of what it is we're trying to describe.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't Malinowski who tried to argue that it's only someone from outside can be objective, as if there is such a thing as objective, as if it even exists. And I think he poisoned the field of ethnography for years to come.
Well, he shaped that field. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they believed they made no impact on the societies that they lived with. And that's also that term, going native, that they were able to pretend to go native and live like natives and observe native people and have no impact, which is just rubbish. They had huge impact, and it's why a lot of Indigenous peoples are suspicious of researchers, because they were intrusive and they were often unethical, and they stole our stories.
Well, and so often the goal was to get a book out, to publish a book.
And to get recognized and promoted and employed, so the whole politics of being a top researcher is another whole nother thing. But I think Indigenous communities now are very much aware of all of that, and much more suspicious or guarded about researchers. They make our jobs really hard, because now we get really scrutinized and asked all sorts of critical questions about what we want to do, why do we want to do it, who owns it, who benefits from it, who are you, what position do you take? All those questions are fair questions, and we have to answer them. We have to have answers for them.
And there must be something in New Zealand that's similar to OCAP in Canada. Ownership, control, access, and possession.
Yeah, there's similar ideas. I mean, I think New Zealand, Canada, Australia in particular, maybe parts of the US, the protocols for researchers are really highly developed. And I know some Native American nations actually have quite strict protocols if you want to do research, like the Navajo Nation. And you do have to apply for permission to the Navajo Nation. You have to fill out forms. You have to answer their questions. So I think our communities are more aware of the concerns, and I don't think we can relax on those concerns at the moment.
Right.
Anyway,
So
I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go now, Lewis. I've got another meeting which is 6 o'clock my time, and you're
4
4
o'clock
o'clock
here.
Melbourne time, and I don't know what time back in Maine.
It is sometime in the middle of the night. It is 2 a.m. in
Oh
Maine.
my goodness.
Yes.
But this is
indeed.
not live, is it?
No, this is not live. It is not live. Yes. And thank you for spending an hour of your time with me. And I'm very appreciative, and time for you to go to your meeting.
Well, good luck on all your endeavours, and I hope you do get some funding, regardless of whether you have randomised control studies. And to your audience, I just wish every person wellness, look after each other, take care, and lovely to meet you, Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you for coming onto the podcast, and everyone be sure and check out Indigenous Methodologies. So
okay.
Okay, bye-bye.